Good day, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Safari Mack Explores Australia. I'm Safari Mack, your guide and host, helping you make connections to the wild. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are still hanging out in awesome Australia, but today we're looking at an unusual form of habitat. Now, when you think of Australia, you're thinking about this huge desert-like region as well as a little bit of some rainforest area, right? What if I told you there were some parts of Australia where it actually does snow? Today we are going to the Australian Alps, this alpine-like habitat where today we look for in the rivers and waterway habitats for one of the world's most unusual creatures, the platypus, otherwise known by their Latin name of Ornithorhynchus anatinus. So if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and get started. But before we begin, if you're new to my channel, hit that like and subscribe button. Check out my Facebook page for content on conservation. And if you have a question about animals, or if there's an animal that you want me to do in the future, you just got to send me an email, which you will always find the link to down in my description below. But if you're ready, I'm ready. We're going to go ahead and just get started. Now, I've said it before, and I'm going to just say it again. Australia is weird. And I mean weird, right? But you know what? It only makes sense that it's weird because when you spend an entire millions of years cut off from the rest of the world, of course there are going to be animals that haven't been able to evolve anywhere else on the planet. And of course, the platypus is no exception. So, we're going to continue on and we're going to look into their evolution and their family. Starting off, of course, with the most unusual form of family. Now, they are mammals, but they're a different kind of mammal, which is really odd. They're what you call, for starters, this group of animals can only be found on the continent of Australia. They're what you call the monotremes, or the egg-laying mammals for short. So, these guys are super bizarre. They do not at all give birth to live young, but instead first lay eggs, and then after the eggs hatch, they feed off of their mother's milk. Now, how it goes is that it's thought that 80 million years ago, mammals were millions of years ago. Let me get back up a little bit. Millions of years ago, mammals during the time, at least when the dinosaurs were beginning to appear, they also laid eggs, and eventually they also nursed on their mother's milk. However, over time, by around 80 million years ago, eventually some mammals began to branch off, and some mammals began to form something that we would call the placenta. Thanks to this, they've been able to adapt a little bit more quickly, and were able to do much more on the planet. Now, today there are only said to be two kinds of monotremes: the platypus, and then all these different subspecies of the echidnas. Now, for platypuses in general, it's thought that around 17 million years, 110 million years ago, there were some historic placental-like, there were some platypus-like mammals that were around, but they would evolve in Australia and create the more modern-day look by around 17 million to 90 million years ago. Now, at least that's according to a study that was done at Oxford University. Now we're going to continue on and see more into their habitat, their lifestyle, and their reproduction. For starters, this creature is not limited just to the alpines, but they are fairly adaptable animals. Somewhat. They are known basically to inhabit areas where there's plenty of water and riverbanks where they can dig a burrow and hide in. So they can be found not just in the alpine district, but also in the rainforest districts of Australia. So they are fairly good animals to adapt to certain conditions, like this kind of riverway. But ponds, rivers, lakes, wherever there's water, there is going to be a platypus for sure. Now, these guys generally live a solitary lifestyle where females may tolerate each other, but males do not want another male in their territory, and they will fight it off with a venomous spur that's on their hind foot. But we'll get into that later on. So, for starters, here's just a quick picture of exactly how big the males are compared to the females. Now, after a special courtship, Mom begins constructing a little burrow on the side of a riverbank to where then she begins to lay anywhere from 1 to 3 special eggs. But now, a little something about these eggs, they're not exactly what you think. Their shells are not really as strong or as firm as that of a bird's egg. No. They're a lot more soft, and so as a result, they're more fragile. So during this time, Mom begins to, after she goes through a pregnancy and then lays these eggs, for the next 10 days or so, she will use her beaver-like tail to gently put these eggs on her belly, where then she kind of balls it up together and will remain there until the eggs hatch. When the eggs hatch, then they begin to nurse from Mom. But instead, these guys are not doing what typical mammals do. They're instead looking for special glands on the female platypus where they can begin to suckle and drink their mother's milk until they're big enough to face the world around them. Now let's get into their diet. So because these are semi-aquatic mammals that have adapted to life in the water, they're looking for different kinds of ways to feed themselves. And so these foods include worms, insect larvae, freshwater shrimp, and what we would call crayfish. In Australia, they're just generally called yabbies. So this is how foraging goes for them. And it might be a little confusing, so I'm going to do my best to explain it. So platypuses, when they're looking they have to find around 20% of their own body weight in food every day, and thus have to spend at least up to 12 hours a day just looking for food or foraging. So, yeah, can you imagine spending all that time just trying to get enough to get to eat? I mean, we're lucky that we have enough food to feed ourselves, but these guys, they got to work hard for it. And I mean, they really do work hard. See, so that bill, or that beak, that really had stumped so many people for so long, thanks to studies, we've been able to figure out that this bill is super sensitive. And how sensitive? Here's how it goes. When they're looking for food, they're not using their eyes, they're not using their ears, and they certainly can't smell with their nostrils in the water. They're actually closing their ears, they're closing their eyes, and their nostrils when they're looking for food. So that bill is actually helping them to find food by means of electrical fields and the detection of the foods of the prey's movements in the water. So talk about an interesting way of feeding yourself. Finally, we're going to end today's episode with their influence in human culture, but also stay tuned for a little special announcement. The first people nations have highly regarded the platypus as a sacred creature, even appearing many times in special mythical creation stories. But of course, they've also, in modern day Australia, they've also been featured on a form of currency. They have, like I said, they've been featured in creation myths as they were seen as a sacred animal, even considered to be too sacred to eat, especially by that tail. They've even been featured as mascots during the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where they were featured along with the echidna and a kookaburra as mascots during the big games. So I'm afraid that's all the information that I've got for today's Part 1 episode. Be sure to join me next week for Part 2, but also, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to join me tomorrow for our next Safari Mack Conservation Conversation episode. And I tell you, I've got some pretty great stories to reveal to you all, but until that happens, this is Safari Mack. I'll see you all out there.